Hello and welcome to Written Words. In this lesson we are going to talk about spicing up your descriptions. So we are going to explore the function of adjectives in description and ways to vary description to make it more interesting. An adjective is a describing word. That's what many of us were taught in school. And it's true, if we want to describe something, we need adjectives. And there are lots of adjectives to choose from. Some of them very commonplace and others more unusual. A tree, for example, that is of considerable height, could be described as tall, lofty, towering, imposing, colossal, gigantic, and so the list goes on. Its foliage, its leaves, could be described as green, lush, verdant, abundant, or, on the other hand, it could be pale, lifeless, withered and faded. A thesaurus is a handy place to turn if you need to find a plentiful list of adjectives to use in your writing. However, simply peppering your sentences with lots of adjectives is not necessarily the most effective form of describing something. Too much uneventful description can be tedious to read, so it's often a good idea to add some actions to liven things up. Adjectives are not the only way to explain what something is like. For example, instead of saying the weather was bad and the rain was heavy, you could write about people dashing around with umbrellas that keep blowing inside out, trying to avoid the puddles. And you get the idea of what the scene is like without even using any adjectives. Bear in mind the five senses. Don't just describe what you can see. There are five senses to choose from. So how does the rain sound? How does it smell? How does it feel? Or possibly even how does it taste? Although there are five senses to choose from, that doesn't necessarily mean you need to include all five senses every time. That could end up being too much. But to vary your writing by using one sense or another changes the angle of the description and makes it more interesting. Use description sparingly though. It's important to create a vivid scene inside the reader's mind. But if the description is lengthy, it can be very tedious to read. For the length of time that you're describing something, the action is put on hold, it's on pause, so the story doesn't progress. So pace your descriptions carefully. And it's important to know when the time is right to move on, to get on with the story so that you take the reader with you and avoid losing them along the way. To take an example from Callanish by William Horwood, which is possibly one of my favourite books. This particular passage describes a golden eagle. The whole story is about a golden eagle. And in this particular passage, he is flying northwards from London to Scotland. He's escaped from London Zoo and he's flying back to his homeland in the north of Scotland. And the passage describes the scenery that he sees along the way. The hills below were rising into moorland, vast and brown, on which the sheep roamed more sparsely. There were occasional stark outcrops of rock and dark pools like tiny versions of the lochans he dimly remembered from his home site. But still in the sky, on either side of the spine of upland, he could see the pall of urban haze that marked man's towns and cities. He pressed on, resting only briefly on a rock outcrop before continuing. So here, the description lasts for just 3 sentences before moving on. The story is about a journey, and the eagle needs to be on his way in order to continue that journey, and so that we can find out what adventures lie in wait for him next. So we can't pause for too long to look at the description, otherwise the journey is halted, the journey isn't carrying on, and the story loses its impetus. The following paragraph after this one follows the same pattern. It has a brief description of the scenery, which is now changing as he gets further north, but then very quickly the journey is resumed. It says, on he went, and then that signifies the end of the description and we're back on with the travelling. The author here knows how much description is just the right amount. So there's not too much description and it doesn't risk interrupting the journey, which is the important part of the story. For our slightly longer extract, we're going to look more closely at the language involved in a scene from Bambi by Felix Salten, another book which, as you can see, has been very well read. This particular book was originally written in German, so this is an English translation. It's from the 1928 English translation by Whittaker Chambers. There have been a number of more recent translations which you might like to explore, but this is the one that I enjoyed and fell in love with as a child. Round about grew hazel bushes, dogwoods, blackthorns, and young elders. Tall sycamores, beeches, and oaks wove a green roof over the thicket, and from the firm, dark brown earth sprang fern fronds, woodvetch, and sage. Underneath, the leaves of violets, which had already bloomed, and of the strawberries, which were just beginning, clung to the ground. Through the thick foliage, the early sunlight filtered in a golden web. The whole forest resounded with myriad voices, was penetrated by them in a joyous agitation. The wood thrush rejoiced incessantly, the doves cooed without stopping, the blackbirds whistled, finches warbled, the field mice chirped. Through the midst of these songs, the jay flew, uttering its quarrelsome cry. The magpie mocked them, and the pheasants cackled loud and high. At times the shrill exulting of a woodpecker rose above all the other voices. The call of the falcon shrilled, light and piercing, over the treetops, and the hoarse crow chorus was heard continuously. This description begins quite traditionally, describing the visual scene. It describes the appearance of the bushes and trees, of the flowers and the earth and all the vegetation in the woods. And then in the second part, there is a sudden shift. We have the sentence, through the thick foliage, the early sunlight filtered in a golden web. It's a beautiful visual scene. But then suddenly, the next sentence says the whole forest resounded with myriad voices. And it describes all the sound in the forest. So we've had a picture of the visual scene, and then halfway through we switch to how it sounds. We concentrate on what we can hear. And I took a look through this extract and attempted to count the number of adjectives. And I made approximately 12. Numbers aren't my strong point, but there are approximately 12 adjectives in this scene. So there's quite a few. But then I looked at the verbs and I counted 19 of those. And the verbs that are used are very varied and quite colourful as far as verbs go. In the visual scene, we've got grew, we've got wove, sprang, clung, bloomed, filtered. A very nice, rich selection of verbs, of the things that are going on in the forest. And then in the second part, the verbs are describing all the different sounds, but without the need for adjectives. So we've got rejoiced, cooed, warbled, whistled, chirped, cackled, shrilled. Lots of different types of verbs to describe the different types of sounds, some of them high, some of them low, some of them pleasant, some of them harsh. It gives you a sense of the huge variety in the chorus of sounds that's going on in the forest. So we have two senses that the author is concentrating on. We've got what can be seen and what can be heard. And then, in addition to using adjectives, there are also a lot of verbs, there are a lot of actions that are used to describe what the scene in the forest is like, to complement the adjectives, so that the description doesn't rely exclusively on adjectives. So far we've talked a lot about adjectives and also about verbs. So for our language focus, let's just take a little look at the different parts of speech in English. The main parts of speech in English are these. A verb, which we've already mentioned, is often described as a doing word. A verb is something that is done, and it informs us about an action or a state of being. So go is a verb, think is a verb. In the extract we just read, we have grow, weave, spring, resound, utter, cackle. All those are things that are being done, so they are verbs. A noun is a name. The word noun means name, and it's a name of a person, a place, a thing, or even just an idea. So computer is a thing, it's a noun. Happiness is a noun. All the names of the different trees and bushes in the extract that we've read and the different types of birds are all nouns. They're all names. An adjective, as we've already mentioned, is a describing word. Small is an adjective. Blue is an adjective. In the extract we've just read, we had adjectives such as tall, thick, brown, loud, hoarse, all describing words. So those are adjectives. Then we have determiners. Determiners are little words that are used to refer more precisely to a noun. For example, that or two, that man, two men. This category also includes articles, the definite article, which in English is the, and the indefinite article, which is a or an. So the man or a man. Also in this category are possessives, little words that explain who or what something belongs to. For example, my computer or your book. An adverb gives us extra information about a verb or an adjective, so it is found with a verb or an adjective. So for example, I ran gives you a certain amount of information, but we've only got the subject, I, and the verb, ran. So if we want to add more information, perhaps about the speed that I was running, you can use an adverb. I ran quickly. That adds some extra information about how I was running. In the same way, adverbs can be used to complement adjectives. So if a task, for example, was difficult, we've only got the adjective at this point, it's difficult. But there are degrees of difficulty. So if it wasn't the most difficult thing in the world, but it was still difficult, you could say it was fairly difficult or quite difficult, and that is an adverb, fairly or quite. Then there are prepositions. Prepositions are often very small words, and they give us information about position or movement or relationship. For example, to, at, in, on, from. If I give a present to my friend, the present is physically moving from me to my friend. So the preposition to indicates that movement. If I am waiting for a bus, I am standing at the bus stop. So at indicates my position. Then finally there are conjunctions. Conjunctions are words which join two or more words or clauses. Possibly the most common of these is and. It can join words together, such as the cat and the dog, or it can join parts of a sentence. So I went to the bus stop and I caught the bus. Because is another conjunction. It joins one part of a sentence with another part of the sentence. And now for our writing prompt for this lesson. Imagine you are in a park on a scorching hot day and describe your walk through the park. There are lots of adjectives that you could use to describe a walk in a park on a very hot day and the scene before you, but use those adjectives sparingly. Don't rely on just the adjectives for your description. Try to spice up your description in other ways instead. Think about the different senses. You don't have to use them all, but use a selection. And think of ways to use verbs to describe the scene. Not just adjectives, but describe what is happening and the actions that are taking place that reflect what that scene is like. Do take a look at the worksheet for this lesson, which covers all the things that we've discussed in this lesson, as well as offering a couple of ideas for some further reading. Thank you very much for joining me. I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson, and in the meantime, happy writing.